The first rays of dawn broke reluctantly over the North Sea, thin, pale, and cold. A mist still clung to the water, drifting in tatters between the blackened hulks of wreckage. Oil slicks stretched for miles, glistening with metallic rainbows. Broken planks, floating boots, torn clothing, and bits of twisted steel bobbed in the calm. It was the aftermath of the largest naval battle of the First World War. A battle Britain had expected to win gloriously and ended winning with a bitter, hollow taste. From the bridge of HMS Iron Duke, Jellicoe watched the horizon with a mixture of fatigue and dread. Overnight, they had fought scattered skirmishes, fired at silhouettes, dodged torpedoes, but they had not found the German fleet's main body again. It was gone. At least a dozen British destroyers were missing. Several cruisers had not reported in. The decks of many of his dreadnoughts were scorched, dented, and littered with spent casings. But the true shock would come only when signals finally arrived, confirming the losses of the night. Only as the fleet reassembled into daylight would Jellicoe learn the full cost. Only then would he understand why his officers whispered, "Something has changed." The Battle of Jutland had ended, but the consequences were only beginning. Shortly after dawn, wireless reports began to pour in from scattered British vessels. Each message carried news Jellicoe dreaded. HMS Invincible, lost, blown in half by a magazine explosion. HMS Defense, destroyed in a catastrophic blast. HMS Black Prince, missing, later confirmed sunk with all hands. HMS Warrior, abandoned after massive damage. HMS Tipperary, ardent, fortune, destroyed during night action. The total British losses were staggering. 14 ships sunk, over 6,000 British sailors dead. The Germans had lost fewer, 11 ships, about 2,500 sailors. Beatty's words from the previous afternoon echoed now with a haunting resonance. There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships. Magazine vulnerability, poor ammunition handling, weak turret armor. Whatever the causes, the results were undeniable. British battlecruisers had exploded with catastrophic ease. Jellicoe said little. His officers saw the strain in his face. The look of a man who understood the public would demand a victory narrative, yet the facts refused to cooperate. While the British fleet gathered its wounded and searched the waters for survivors, the German high seas fleet was limping toward the safety of Wilhelmshaven. Smoke poured from the battered hull of SMS Seydlitz. Her bow was nearly underwater. Crews manned pumps without rest, fighting to keep the ship afloat. Derflinger had taken over 20 shell hits. Her decks were soaked with seawater and blood. Lutzow, Hipper's flagship, had been abandoned during the night. She was too damaged to save. Her crew scuttled her after hours of desperate effort. Shear's report that morning was blunt. "We have suffered great damage. The fleet cannot resume operations for months." Germany had survived, but only barely. Still, in Berlin, newspapers would declare victory. Scheer would be hailed as a hero, and the Kaiser would claim that the high seas fleet had thrown the gauntlet at England's feet. But this was illusion. The fleet was broken, its morale shaken, its future operations limited forever. Behind the facade of triumph lay a harsh truth. Germany could not risk another battle like Jutland. When the British fleet returned to Scapa Flow, wounded and exhausted, they expected a mix of relief and muted acceptance from the Admiralty. Instead, they were met with chaos. London newspapers had already printed headlines, some claiming victory, some demanding answers, some declaring disaster. Politicians were confused. The public, fed on a century of Royal Navy invincibility, expected a replay of Trafalgar. Instead, they got something that did not fit any story they understood. When the Admiralty released the early casualty counts, the shock was immediate. British losses were heavier. German losses were lighter, and the Germans had returned home claiming triumph. The British public erupted with anger. How could the greatest navy in the world lose more ships? Why did German ships seem harder to sink? Why did the Grand Fleet let the Germans escape? The questions piled up, and the Admiralty did not yet have answers. Even Jellicoe sensed that the battle, though strategically a British success, would become a political firestorm. He reportedly said to a colleague that week, "I am certain history will require time to make sense of Jutland, but politics will not wait on history." He was right. Within hours of the fleet's return, the Admiralty convened emergency meetings to decide how to frame the outcome. First Sea Lord Sir Henry Jackson, Churchill's successor, struggled to present a clear narrative. Britain had maintained naval supremacy, prevented Germany from breaking the blockade, forced the high seas fleet back into port. These were strategic realities. But the public did not care about strategy. They cared about numbers, and the numbers looked terrible. Meanwhile, Germany launched a coordinated propaganda campaign. Germany wins the Battle of Jutland. British losses far greater. High seas fleet returns triumphant. It didn't matter that the German fleet wouldn't leave port for the rest of the war. It didn't matter that the blockade remained intact. It didn't matter that Britain still ruled the sea. Germany controlled the first narrative, and the British Admiralty, slow, bureaucratic, and clinging to old habits, lost the information war before it even began. This exposed another weakness. Britain was utterly unprepared for modern propaganda. Behind closed doors, a far more personal battle was brewing. Beatty, charismatic, impulsive, politically connected, privately blamed Jellicoe's caution for letting the Germans escape. He never said so directly, but his tone, private letters, and conversations with officers made the implication clear. Jellicoe, in turn, believed Beatty's recklessness had cost thousands of lives by rushing ahead and losing control of his battlecruisers early in the day. The Royal Navy now had two competing narratives. Beatty's view: we should have struck harder. Jellicoe was too cautious. Jellicoe's view: we could not risk losing the fleet. Beatty's tactics were flawed. This rivalry would poison British naval leadership for years. One senior officer later reflected, "Jutland was two battles. One fought with guns, and one fought with egos. The second proved far more destructive. A battle is often judged by statistics. Ships sunk, shells fired, casualties recorded. But Jutland's real human cost was carried by the men who worked in the choking heat of the engine rooms, who dragged wounded shipmates from fires, who drowned in darkness as steel bulkheads folded. Hundreds of letters from sailors, many published posthumously, reveal a deeper emotional landscape. A young signalman from HMS Invincible wrote home only days before the battle. They say we will soon meet the Germans. If I fall, know that I'm not afraid. The sea is our home." He didn't survive the explosion that split the ship in half. A gunner on HMS Warrior, rescued only after his ship was abandoned, recalled, "We fired until the guns burned our hands. I saw men carrying ammunition barefoot because the deck was too hot to stand on. When we abandoned ship, I looked back and thought, she gave her life for us." For many survivors, the trauma of Jutland lingered for years. Some never spoke of it. Some returned to sea immediately. Others left the Navy entirely. Jutland was not just a clash of steel and strategy. It was a shattering human experience. Historians often describe Jutland as a strategic victory, but tactical disappointment. But that phrase understates the full scope of what the battle revealed. Jutland exposed 5 critical British weaknesses. 1. Ammunition handling was catastrophic. British battlecruisers stored volatile cordite propellant in unsafe ways to increase firing rates. Charges lay unprotected in turrets, hallways, and handling rooms. Result: 3 ships exploded almost instantly when shells penetrated their turrets. German ships, with safer procedures and better armored magazines, never suffered similar magazine explosions. 2. Armor schemes were flawed. British battlecruisers were built for speed, not resilience. Their deck armor and turret protection were insufficient for prolonged engagements. Several officers had warned the Admiralty before the battle. They were ignored. 3. Communication was outdated and unreliable. Beatty's signals went unseen. Jellicoe received incomplete reports. Ships misinterpreted orders during maneuvers. The Royal Navy's communication system, flags, lamps, and imperfect wireless, was no match for the chaos of modern naval battles. 4. The chain of command was divided. Beatty and Jellicoe represented two different philosophies. Beatty, bold, aggressive, risk-taking. Jellicoe, cautious, methodical, preservation-focused. Both believed they were right. Neither trusted the other. This internal fracture would shape the future of the Royal Navy. 5. Britain underestimated propaganda warfare. Germany shaped the narrative before Britain even tried. A tactical loss became, in the public mind, a strategic failure. The Admiralty realized too late that in modern war, perception can be as powerful as firepower. In November 1916, after months of political pressure and public confusion, the government quietly made its decision. Jellicoe, victor of the largest fleet action in modern history, was removed as commander of the Grand Fleet and reassigned as First Sea Lord, a political move to sideline him. Beatty replaced him. The message was clear. Britain needed a hero, not a cautious strategist. But history has been kinder to Jellicoe. Modern analyses confirm that if he had acted recklessly, the British might have lost the entire Grand Fleet, and with it, the war. As Churchill later wrote, he was the only man on either side who could have lost the war in an afternoon, and he did not lose it. But Jellicoe's caution came with a cost: public misunderstanding, political frustration, and eventual dismissal. Jutland was a strategic British victory. The blockade held. The German fleet never again ventured out in force. Britain maintained control of the sea, yet the battle also shattered illusions. It revealed weaknesses long ignored. It exposed rivalries long simmering. It showed the limits of empire and the dangers of complacency. For Britain, Jutland was not the triumph it wanted. For Germany, it was not the victory it claimed. For the men who fought, it was neither. For them, it was a storm of fire, steel, and survival. A day when the sea itself felt like an enemy. But the story of Jutland was not over. How Britain responded, how it reformed, rebuilt, and re-examined its navy would determine the future of naval warfare. And the true legacy of Jutland would not be understood until decades later, when a new war brought new fleets, new ships, and new challenges. In the years after the Battle of Jutland, the Royal Navy continued to dominate the world's oceans. Its ships still circled the globe, its sailors still patrolled the empire's vast arteries of trade, and its admirals still commanded with confidence. But deep inside the Admiralty, beneath the polished brass, beneath the portraits of Nelson and Hood, beneath the certainty of British naval tradition, another truth was taking shape. Jutland had exposed wounds that tradition alone could not heal. It was no longer enough to claim victory by blockade. No longer enough to trust old doctrines. No longer enough to assume naval supremacy simply because Britain had possessed it for a century. The battle had revealed flaws in design, flaws in leadership, flaws in communication and command philosophy. And as the 1920s dawned, those flaws threatened to calcify into systemic weakness. Jutland was not just a battle, it was a warning, and Britain now had to decide whether it would learn from it or repeat it. In the months after the battle, public pressure mounted for answers. Families demanded explanations for the deaths of thousands of sailors. Parliament demanded clarity about losses. Newspapers published contradictory interpretations daily. By late 1916, Britain was hungry for accountability. A formal investigation was inevitable. The first Jutland Inquiry, 1916. The initial Admiralty report, hurriedly assembled, concluded vaguely that the battle was a strategic victory, but offered no real explanation for the catastrophic losses of British ships. Critics immediately pounced. Why did 3 battlecruisers explode? Why were German ships harder to sink? Why didn't Britain trap and annihilate the entire German fleet? Why did Beatty's force become disorganized? Why did Jellicoe let the Germans escape? Public frustration intensified. The second Jutland Inquiry, 1919. This was more rigorous. Technical experts dissected turret designs, magazine layouts, armor schemes, and tactical movements. Their findings made one thing unmistakably clear. Jutland had not been a failure of courage, but of systems. and those systems needed to change. Long after the guns fell silent, the Royal Navy continued to fight another battle, a political and ideological struggle between two of its most powerful figures. Jellicoe, methodical, cerebral, and deeply aware of the catastrophic cost of losing the fleet. His priority: preservation, discipline, and caution. Beatty, charismatic, impulsive, and adored by younger officers. His priority: aggression, boldness, and decisive action. The Jutland inquiries only deepened the divide. Beatty's supporters argued Jellicoe failed to finish the enemy. He was too cautious. He let Germany slip away. Jellicoe's supporters countered. Beatty failed to control his battlecruisers. His communication was chaotic. His ships were unprepared for German gunfire. In truth, both men were right and both were wrong. But politics cares little for nuance. Beatty's personal charm and public popularity eventually overshadowed Jellicoe's measured reasoning. By 1919, Beatty became First Sea Lord, the pinnacle of naval authority. With his appointment, Britain's naval doctrine shifted dramatically. If Jutland revealed the cracks, the post-war years became the era of repair. The Admiralty was forced to admit that British ammunition handling had been dangerously lax. Safety doors had been pinned open. Charges were stored in turret passages for convenience. Flash-type precautions had been widely ignored. New regulations were put into place. Strict magazine safety protocols, improved flash-tight doors, better propellant storage, mandatory fire drills, structural redesigns of turrets and ammunition hoists. It was a cultural shift as much as a technical one. A senior gunnery officer wrote, "We believed in speed. Jutland showed we must first believe in safety." By the 1920s, the Royal Navy's magazine protection had become among the best in the world. Jutland forced the Royal Navy to confront an uncomfortable truth. The battlecruiser concept, fast ships with light armor, was fundamentally flawed for fleet engagements. "We sacrificed armor for speed," a post-war design report admitted, and paid the price. Although Beatty, a lifelong battlecruiser advocate, resisted the criticism, new ships began adopting all-or-nothing armor schemes inspired by American designs, focusing heavy armor on critical areas and abandoning widespread thin protection. The result: stronger, more resilient capital ships. Jutland demonstrated that 19th century communication methods no longer worked in modern war. Beatty's garbled signals early in the battle had contributed to fatal confusion. Post-war reforms included modernized wireless sets, trained radio operators, standardized tactical signals, dedicated signals officers on all major warships, a new emphasis on radio discipline during battle. For the first time, the Royal Navy accepted that technology, not tradition alone, would define future command. British gunnery had been inconsistent at Jutland. Some ships fired brilliantly. Others lost sight of targets in smoke and haze. The Navy invested heavily in improved rangefinders, better director systems, advanced fire control tables, centralized targeting systems. These changes dramatically enhanced British accuracy in the 1920s and 1930s. German ships survived Jutland partly due to superior internal compartmentalization and damage control training. Britain took note. Naval colleges introduced damage control courses, flooding simulation drills, fire containment strategies, improved watertight door systems, reinforced bulkheads. These skills would prove invaluable in the next global conflict. The public had believed in a myth that the Royal Navy would always deliver decisive victories. Jutland shattered that illusion. For the first time in living memory, Britain felt vulnerable at sea. This emotional shift contributed to growing political pressure for naval reforms, government transparency, accountability for Admiralty decisions. It also fed the rise of anti-war sentiment in the 1920s. Britain entered the post-war era financially exhausted. The Washington Naval Conference sought to limit naval armaments and prevent another ruinous arms race. Jutland played a subtle role here. The lessons of the battle, particularly the vulnerability of battlecruisers and the limited value of sheer numbers, encouraged Britain to agree to ship limits. The logic was simple. Quality was more important than quantity. No fleet should risk a Jutland-type disaster again. This marked the beginning of the end for the age of the dreadnought. Jutland influenced naval thinkers globally. In Germany, it deepened the belief that submarines, not battleships, were the future. One German officer wrote, "We built a fleet to rival Britain." Jutland proved we should have built submarines. In Japan and the United States, naval theorists studied Jutland obsessively, drawing conclusions about long-range gunnery, armor schemes, command systems, night fighting, fleet maneuvering. These lessons shaped the Pacific War decades later. While strategists debated doctrines and designers redrew blueprints, the men who survived Jutland carried quieter burdens. Many never spoke of the battle again. Others wrote memoirs decades later, haunted, conflicted, unresolved. A stoker from HMS Malaya recalled, "We worked in heat you cannot imagine. When a shell hit, the lights went out. All I could hear were men screaming in the dark. Jutland never left me." A German sailor from Derflinger wrote in a private diary, "When a British shell struck, we felt the ship shudder like a living thing. I knew then that the sea had no loyalty to us." There were stories of heroism, too. Quiet, uncelebrated acts. Sailors hauling wounded shipmates through flames. Officers giving up lifeboat spots. Engineers staying below to keep pumps running as water rushed in. Medics treating burns with nothing but cold seawater. These human stories were often overshadowed by the grand narratives of strategy and politics. But they were the real essence of Jutland. Not the tactics, not the doctrines, not the arguments, the men. By the 1930s, the Royal Navy was preparing for another war, one more mechanized, more global, and more dangerous than the last. The hidden influence of Jutland shaped every aspect of this new navy. 1. Stronger magazine protection. Battleships like King George V and Prince of Wales were built with far safer ammunition handling. Lessons learned directly from the loss of Queen Mary and Invincible. 2. Improved fire control systems. British radar and advanced fire control systems, introduced in the late 1930s, were rooted in the post-Jutland push for modern targeting technology. 3. Better damage control. When Prince of Wales was struck by multiple torpedoes in 1941, her crew's damage control training, descended from post-Jutland reforms, saved the ship long enough for evacuation. 4. More realistic understanding of battlecruisers. The tragic fate of HMS Hood in 1941, destroyed by Bismarck in minutes, reflected a lesson Britain learned too late. Some weaknesses cannot be designed around. Jutland foreshadowed Hood's demise. History had warned. The warning was not fully heeded. At its core, Jutland revealed a deeper British weakness, one not made of steel or cordite, but of belief. For generations, Britain believed in its naval supremacy as an unchanging truth, a certainty, a destiny. Jutland shattered that illusion. It proved that technology can fail, leadership can falter, tradition can blind. Even the greatest navy can be humbled. As one Admiralty historian later wrote, Jutland taught us that supremacy is not an inheritance. It is a responsibility, one we must earn in every generation. The Battle of Jutland did not decide the First World War. It did not destroy the Royal Navy. It did not send Germany to ruin or elevate Britain to glory. Its impact was subtler, yet far more profound. It forced Britain to confront its weaknesses. It forced reinvention. It forced humility. And in doing so, it quietly shaped the Royal Navy that would later face submarines in the Atlantic, Japanese carriers in the Pacific, and the brutal realities of a second global war. Jutland was not a triumph, nor was it a defeat. It was a reckoning, a moment when the world's greatest naval power saw itself clearly for the first time and did not entirely like what it saw.